Haumatakiape, Ihane Wambli Watakpe Inichiape. Hi, my name is Sean Sherman. I am the CEO and founder of the Sioux Chef and also our nonprofit NATIFS, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, where we are currently running our nonprofit kitchen called the Indigenous Food Lab. And I'm going to be here to talk to you today about Indigenous foods, about the future of Indigenous foods, and how I feel like this is such valuable information for anybody who wants to understand. Myself, I grew up on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. I'm enrolled with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe. I currently live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Right now we are sitting on the site of our new restaurant, Owamni, which overlooks a beautiful and sacred space for the Dakota people that have lived here for millennia. Everywhere we are in the United States, in Canada, North America, in the Americas, we're on Indigenous land space. And we have access to very little understanding of Indigenous foods, let alone having access to Indigenous restaurants. So part of the work that we're doing is trying to raise awareness about Indigenous foods, the importance of it, the histories that are often not talked about and often invisible to us, and how we can move forward with bringing this knowledge base into our daily lives. Indigenous food systems in the most simplest form are localized regional food systems utilizing a mixture of agriculture and permaculture and just centuries of tradition and cultural teachings behind it. So this work, as we grow our staff, as we grow a new generation of Indigenous thought leaders when it comes to culinary applications, I feel like we can make a lot of healthy changes. And a lot of these changes that I'm trying to make are something to really return to the situation that I grew up around on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. My mom moved us off the reservation, my sister and I, when we were very young, right before I started high school, and I started working in restaurants. I started working in kitchens right away. And I worked my way up, after college and became a pretty young chef in the city of Minneapolis. And a few years into my chef career, I had that epiphany of realizing that I knew very little about my own Lakota ancestry when it came to foods. I could name hundreds of European recipes off the top of my head because that was the culinary education that I had received with all the books that I have read and with all the recipes that we were playing with. And that's just kind of where culinary was at. But when I started really thinking about what were my ancestors eating, what kind of foods were they trading, what were they growing, how are they harvesting, where was that knowledge of all this vast plant life, of utilizing it for food, for medicine, for shelter. And there was just so many questions that I had to ask. And I really wished that my grandparents were still alive at that point because they could have answered so many strong questions that I would have had at that moment. But I had to just go on and try and figure it out myself. There wasn't a lot of information out there. I couldn't just go online and buy Joy of Native American Cooking because that didn't exist. So I had to really dig deep and start to try to piece together, that knowledge base of what my ancestors, how they were processing foods, how they were storing foods, what kind of foods were they gathering, and what were they doing when they're breaking down whole animals, and all of those pieces. And I just really saw a very clear path of what to look for and what to understand. So I set on that path to try and understand. And eventually I was able to form this company, the Sioux Chef, and to start working on Indigenous meals and decolonized meals and even business ideas that could really showcase this. So when I formed the Sioux Chef in 2014, we opened up the Tatanka truck, our first food truck, that was in partnership with Little Earth Community of United Tribes here in Minnesota, in Minneapolis. And we really wanted to do something healthy. So we cut out colonial ingredients. We stopped using dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, beef, pork, or chicken, just to prove a point, because those foods didn't exist here and have not existed here on this land space for that long. We knew that we could move forward utilizing foods that are actually from here. We could be utilizing wild foods and agricultural foods, searching for heirloom seeds, searching for farmers that were still growing those, and really trying to rethink what is modern day Indigenous culinary and why is that important. And we were able to showcase that we can do that. And we've come a long ways in a very few short years. We released our cookbook, the Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, in 2017, and it has over 100 recipes utilizing this philosophy. We are opening up our first brick and mortar in 2021 with the Owamni restaurant. We are moving forward with our vision of the Indigenous Food Lab and all the good that can come through that. And we're starting to see so much influence out there on social media with a whole new generation of Indigenous chefs who are passionate about being able to bring this back to their communities, to the land that they're living in, to the cities, because we should live in a world where we have Indigenous restaurants in every single city to represent that land space, particularly run by Indigenous peoples that are still here today. And I think we can get there. I think there's a lot we can do, but we have to understand how damaging this history was. All history begins with Indigenous history. When we're thinking about Native restaurants, we utilize terms like pre-colonial foods and decolonizing our diets. And I think it's really important for people to understand what that even means. And I think that part of that is just breaking down that term. Like, what does the term colonialism even mean? To define colonialism simply, it's just the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically, which obviously is something that's not unique to the United States or Canada. We've seen it all over the globe, especially coming from European powers. We see it affecting all of North America, South America, Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. When we're thinking about how this happened here in the United States, you kind of have to go all the way back to the term manifest destiny, which basically gave European powers the right to say that they owned something if they found it. And this act of claiming the unknown and claiming things that weren't theirs is really something that's still built into the fabric of who we are as a nation today. So if you go back to the year 1800, you're still at war with Great Britain. We're basically just a little bit more than the original 13 colonies. And the reality is that this whole land space of North America is still controlled by the Indigenous communities that have been holding their spaces for so long. And you have to see that just during that one century, from 1800 to 1900, European powers are taking huge claims. This land is kind of cut up with colonial lines. So much awful tragedy happens to the Indigenous peoples of this land space. Looking back at my past and my family's past, my great-grandfather was born in the late 1850s. And he, during his lifetime, sees all of this struggle between Lakota and the U.S. cavalry and all these battles that were going on throughout that time period between 1860s and the 1880s. He sees the Battle of Little Bighorn when he's 18 years old. He sees our families getting pushed onto the Pine Ridge Reservation. He sees the Wounded Knee massacre happen there. His children have to go through boarding schools to cut their hair, to learn English, to learn Christianity. And so much change to witness in one single lifetime. Even in my own lifetime, I was born in 1974, so 100 years prior to my birth in 1874 in South Dakota, my Lakota ancestors still held 100% of their Indigenous knowledge base intact at that point, including their food systems and the knowledge of the food around them. By the time I'm born in the 70s, there's very little of this Indigenous food system left alive at all. We have to understand how damaging this history was, how pointed the United States government was at destroying Indigenous cultures to take over these lands, because the one thing that the U.S. did learn right away is that every time it was able to push Indigenous peoples off their land space, take ownership to it, they were able to commodify it, to sell it, and the U.S. government made a ton of money off of these stolen Indigenous lands. The U.S. has never come to terms with the amount of wealth it made from stolen Indigenous lands, on top of stealing Indigenous peoples from Africa to build these land spaces and to build this wealth and to build, a lot of these companies that are still well and active today, and a lot of these families who have a lot of ancestral wealth and privilege built into them as a direct result from this time period, which again is not ancient history. So we have to really understand why it's important to tell these true stories, to not to, hide behind narratives that are untrue for the sake of feeling more comfortable. We have to be able to talk about some of these uncomfortable truths that have happened to this literal genocide of Indigenous peoples that happened on these land spaces. And it's been really unfortunate that Indigenous peoples peoples have lost so much of their foodways because of this colonial history and this oppression and assimilation efforts that we've gone through. But we can get back to this. We can really rebuild. We can start to understand a better future and a better way. Part of this is just understanding how indigenous food systems work as we move forward. And part of this is also understanding what we've lost. So when I started researching, it was that question again, like, how did we lose so much within just 100 years, and what was that knowledge base that we did lose? So the eradication of indigenous education that happened to us, especially in boarding school situations, which began in the late 1800s and continue all the way through the 1900s. And they're also called residential schools, of course, up in Canada. But we just look at this generation of these young students that were pulled directly from their cultures and forced to learn something completely different. So when I visited Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which was the first of the boarding school systems, these were militarized school systems for these young children, where a lot of these young children were put on boxcars, shipped across the country to be assimilated and reprogrammed with the Western education. We visited the graveyard to pay our respects and learned that the graveyard had actually been almost twice as large, but it was taking up too much space for their war college that sits there now, so they moved it to a much smaller plot. And it's just so disrespectful. And we shouldn't have to worry about children not surviving school. But that was a huge worry of what was going on back then. These kids that went to the school, they were taught corporal punishment, which was something new to them because these indigenous cultures had so much respect for children and for elderly. They would never think about physically harming their children. These kids were taught this, physical punishment situation as an educational tool. And they were also subject to a lot of physical abuse, mental abuse, sexual abuse. And it was really devastating for a lot of these kids to be reprogrammed and then thrown back into their communities where they were no longer accepted after coming back for quite a few years, barely knowing their languages again. And we can still see that trauma manifesting in today's communities. We still are living with high rates of domestic abuse and physical abuse and sexual abuse and mental abuse and drug and alcohol addiction as a direct result from a lot of these efforts. We see a lot of food insecurity in places like Pine Ridge. And it's a direct link to the history of what has happened to Indigenous peoples here in America. I grew up with the Commodity Food Program, which is a government program that's on a lot of tribal communities today. And you look at this huge food supply of overprocessed foods that are high in sodiums, high in bad fats, high in sugars, and there's just a lot of low nutrition. And it's no wonder why some of our indigenous communities are suffering from upwards to 60% type 2 diabetes, let alone massive rates of obesity and heart disease and all these other foodborne illnesses that are a direct result of this low nutritional food system that we're stuck with, And we have to get past that. We have to even get past the notion of fry bread tacos or indigenous tacos or Indian tacos or whatever you guys want to call them, because I grew up with them and they tasted great, but they really have no holding to like who we truly are. There's no reason why that food should identify all of us as indigenous peoples, especially in North America, because we're so diverse. There's so much diversity. So when we're looking at indigenous education, a big part of it is understanding the true diversity of indigenous peoples that are still out there, because there are 622 tribes in Canada, 573 in the US, 20% of Mexico identifying as indigenous. If you just think about like how large North America is, for example, and how many different growing regions and climate regions and ecoregions there are, with mountains and deserts and high plateaus and swamps and all the coastal regions and Arctic and subarctic and tropical. Like there's just so much immense diversity right there. And then you layer it on with indigenous people. So, if you look at an indigenous language map, you can start to see kind of the true diversity right there, because you see, all of these different regions and all these different zones, and knowing that every few hundred miles you're traveling into, you're in a different language area, and there's different religions and there's different foods, and that's exciting to think about. And our vision is that one day we can drive across this land space, stopping at indigenous run businesses, experience all of this cultural and culinary diversity. And that should really be what, what we can really hold on to. That's how we should be thinking about where we are, and how food here in Minnesota should be different than food in Seattle or food in Southern California or food in the Northeast and beyond. When you look at Mexican food, it's way more indigenous still today than it is influenced by Spanish or French, because we still have the nixtamalized corn products with tortillas and tamales. And, so if you're decolonizing Mexican plates, you're taking away beef and pork and chicken and cheese and sour cream. But what's left is all this beauty with beans and chilies and chocolate. And we should be looking at foods like that across the world, because we see the same situation with all this global diversity of indigenous communities, and how we can start to take steps to reclaim true indigenous regional diversity. So I like to really just think about how can we break it down into some of those educational pieces for us to really easily understand. One of the education pieces we typically learn about Native American people is how they would break down a bison and use every single part of that animal. They had that same mentality for everything, for utilizing plants, because plants will have many different aspects to it. It could be food, it could be medicine, you can craft with it, you can build things with it, you can do all sorts of stuff. That's just a lesson to really think about how resourceful indigenous peoples were, because we had to be. We didn't have the privilege to be wasteful. We couldn't just throw away stuff. Today we live in a society where we buy something and literally throw it away a few minutes later. When it comes to animals, like literally anything moving around there is literally game, Small animals, large animals, ocean animals, water animals in general, insects, like everything is out there. People had figured out were protein sources. So you shouldn't be afraid of proteins if it doesn't happen to be a cow, a pig, or a chicken, because there's so many other protein sources out there, and you don't need a lot of protein to survive. Like, you need a good amount, but you don't need a ton, and it doesn't even have to be animal protein. When we started working our businesses with our catering company and the food truck, and we cut out beef, pork, and chicken just to prove a point. Here in Minnesota, we're using bison and rabbit and turkey and ducks and quail and all sorts of lake fish, because we have over almost 15,000 lakes here in Minnesota. So there's just like so much out there. And that's, just one part of it. So I think that, when you're understanding animals, that's how we should be thinking about it, and starting to include a lot more animal species where we can, where it's sustainable, obviously. When it comes to plants, that's a whole different story. When I started trying to connect to the knowledge base of my ancestors and what they knew, I was really curious about the plants. Right out of high school, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service as a field surveyor. So my first job there was to learn all of the names of the plants in the Northern Black Hills. It just kind of opened up my eyes and helped me to start to see, like, there's all of these different plants, and there's all these different flavors. Started learning about all these different berries that weren't typical, because you don't see them in the grocery store. You don't see them in a menu in recipes, but they were around us, and they're edible and they're fun. So when I started researching what my native ancestors were eating, I started looking for ethnobotanical data right away. Like, I wanted to know, like, what plants were people harvesting and gardening and growing, and which parts were they using, and which season were they growing it. And I grew up with this wild prairie turnip that we called timsala. Camas root was such an important one for such a large area of like the Great Basin region and the Pacific Northwest. Where we are in Minnesota, we have the true wild rice, which grows on these lakes around the Great Lakes region. Sometimes some of these plants might be out ready to harvest within just 2 weeks. That's all you get of the whole season, and then it's gone. So for us here in Minnesota, it starts with maple season per se, and you're able to go out and pull all of this beautiful sap out of these maple trees, all these sugar maples around us, but also knowing that we can tap other trees. There's box elder, which are also a form of maple. There's birch trees and black walnut trees. And then from there, our season takes off. You're going to be seeing all sorts of spring vegetables popping up, and then everything fills out, and then you're full into summer, and there's all sorts of blossoms, and you're into berries and fruits, and then you're into the harvest seasons, and it just goes on. And it was just understanding that cycle of life, the cycle of seasons, and understanding how indigenous communities were utilizing moon cycles. So they're following every moon, every 13 moons, and knowing like which moon is which. Is this the moon of the wild rice? Is this the moon of strawberries? Is this the moon of which fish to gather? Plants, I feel like, is the best way, because understanding plant knowledge is power. And I really feel like, that's something that we can be teaching our youth today. I would always tease that our kids can can name more Kardashians than they can tree species, and I feel like that is unfortunate because we need to be really thinking about what important lessons are we teaching our youth of today? Because when you start understanding the names of plants and understanding the values of these plants around us and what they are good for, you're going to start to see nothing but food and medicine all around you. And that becomes really exciting. And I feel like that takes us into agriculture, because I feel like the agricultural scene of the Americas is highly unsung. So many of the world's important food crops that are out there in today's world are coming from the Americas. We see corn, we see bean, we see squash, we see chili peppers, we see chocolate. There's so much. Potatoes. One of the first things that I did when I started researching this was to start to connect with some of these indigenous seed keepers that are out there. We're lucky that we have some of these native seeds around us today, that we still have seeds coming from the Hidatsa tribes and Mandad tribes and Ponca tribes and all the tribes in the Southwest and the Southeast and all these different tribes across Mexico and further south, all the way into South America. There's so much amazing seed varietal out there, and all of it's in danger, so we have to understand that this generation where we are right now today, like, we have to be the stewards of these seeds for the next generation, because if we don't stand up for them, they can be bought out, they can be held, they can be modified, and they can be something completely different, and we can lose them just like that. We're living in this world today where we think we are the epitome of world agriculture, with all of this monoculture going on, with all of this GMO situation happening. But we know the amount of chemical that it takes to maintain this, and what this chemical is doing to us, we have no idea. You're seeing all this food like glyphosate. It's inside all of our breakfast cereals. It's inside of cans of food. It's inside of everything, snacks, and drinks, and it's really kind of scary, So we should be thinking about whole foods. We should be thinking about foods that are very regional and protecting those foods when it comes down to it, because indigenous peoples, especially in America, had figured out so many different ways for farming and agriculture. You had the Mayan civilization. So if you ever visit the Yucatan, they didn't have any above ground water. They figured out how to make an amazing agricultural system utilizing below ground water. Or you follow that further north into the southwest of what is the United States, where they came up with waffle systems for farming and figured out how to irrigate farming situations in an area where there was very little irrigation, and to eventually grow seeds out that become more heat resistant and more drought resistant and are able to thrive in a desert environment. Or seeds way up in our regions where people had figured out how to farm in extremely short growing seasons, because here in Minnesota we basically have about 5 months of a beautiful growing season, and then we're in for about 27 months of winter. So it's really important that you understand that cycle again, like how people were able to grow things out, grow corn in fewer days, and be able to do everything in that short time period. So as we're thinking about a lot of this perspective on indigenous foodways moving forward, like, how do we actually apply it to today's world right now? You can apply this to anywhere in the world. So it doesn't matter if you're, again, in Australia or New Zealand or Hawaii or South America. We can work back to try and help preserve indigenous communities and to bring back a better sense of what is regional, culturally appropriate foodways everywhere, utilizing a mix of agriculture, permaculture, and all these lessons from indigenous communities that have stayed with us for so long. There's no reason we should not be landscaping with the purpose of food. We should just be placing food everywhere we can, and having kitchens that are trained to be able to harvest this. Lawns are stupid, right? There's no good purpose for them at all. And if we just put food everywhere, just think about how much we could be processing, not only for ourselves, but for our community. And that's that lesson with indigenous food systems, because they're community-based, regional, culturally appropriate food systems. So think about a city that has huge open lots. If we just took the time to reset all of that, and just put food plants everywhere, trees and everything that can be harvested, and just how much of a food pantry could that create? It could be immense, If we have the technology to have 30 golf courses in a town like Palm Springs, California, in the middle of the desert, just think what we could do if we put our efforts for the good of all of us in our community. There's no reason why some of these rural indigenous communities are suffering from so many food access issues when we can just be rebuilding these communities and just placing food all around us. But it's really important that we think about how does culinary application come into this, because we need to have trained kitchens that know what to do with a lot of these wild foods. We need to have less regulations on us. We need to be able to come up with our own food codes where we can maintain safety in culinary, but also be able to utilize a lot of this wild food around us, because we could be creating pantries that are unique to our regions, that are unique to where we are right now today. So there's all sorts of stuff around us. Here in Minnesota, we could be utilizing, of course, like hyssops and bergamots and cedars and pines and all the other conifers. We could be harvesting mushrooms and drying those out, and all these different herbs and tubers and wild onions and wild gingers. And there's just like so much, and that's our pantry. That's what we have to work with. And that's what's going to set us apart and make us unique comparatively to tribes in the East Coast or tribes in the Pacific Northwest. And that's something that our kitchen has been striving to do for quite a while. And that's a big part of why we created the Indigenous Food Lab in general, was to create a safe place for us to not only learn ourselves and to educate ourselves and to reclaim a lot of this indigenous knowledge base, but also to really hold it for the next generation, because the best thing we can do in our lifetime is set up our next generation for success. So all I'm trying to do, and all our group is trying to do with this work, is just to be able to set up a kitchen where there's training and education focused, and really try to teach a new generation of indigenous culinary and indigenous food producers of how we can move forward with this, and how we can be a lot more thoughtful about where our food is coming from, who we're purchasing food from, because we try to purchase as much as food as we can from indigenous food producers first, then we're supporting our local food growers around us, and then we're buying organic at the bottom of that scale, because we truly believe it's going to be important to support just BIPOC growers out there, because people who haven't had the privilege to set up farms, or their families didn't grow up with a lot of money, and we need to work hard to be able to work towards supporting people who can really continue to bring a lot of culture and tradition into the future generations. And I think it's really fun for chefs in particular to be able to think about this new world, this being able to just have so much more food diversity in our diets. Because if you look at the typical Western diet, or just look at the typical menu anywhere, you're going to find very little food diversity or plant diversity in general in that, because everybody's using the same stuff, because that's what's being sold. So you have some tomato and some onion and some garlic and maybe some apple and carrot and celery, but most people are going to stop counting in their 20s about how much plant diversity is actually in their diet. Whereas indigenous diets opens up so much more plant diversity and food diversity into those diets. And there's just so much more possibilities when it comes to mixing and matching flavors and coming up with new recipes and making food taste like exactly where we are. And that was a challenge that we tried to do when we were, growing with this, with these notions of creating modern indigenous kitchens and culinary operations, So we're creating dishes that might have some roasted bison and some chokecherry sauce and some wild prairie turnips and some wild greens, and literally all of these pieces, we would be able to see just like looking around a land space. Or maybe we're utilizing wild rice and walleye and rose hips and blueberries and white cedar. We could be standing on one lake spot in Minnesota and just glancing around and seeing all those ingredients right around us. Being able to bring this back into our indigenous communities is going to be extremely impactful, and that's why we started the work that we're doing today. So with NATIFS and the creation of our nonprofit, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, it was really focused on two very particular pieces: creating access to indigenous education and creating access to indigenous foods. So Indigenous Food Lab is doing just that. So right now we're based in Minneapolis. It's our very first nonprofit kitchen. We've been doing a lot of food relief because we were born in the midst of the pandemic. But our real goal of what we're trying to do is set up a system to be able to work directly with tribal communities, to be able to help them to develop their own indigenous culinary programming. So our kitchen can help train their leaders how to develop recipes and menus for those communities in those languages, utilizing foods that's appropriate to them and giving them all the tools necessary. We just want to become a support center to help more and more indigenous food production out there. We want to be working with more higher education and just education institutions in general, so they can start to normalize by putting indigenous foods on their menus so their students can have access to it. We're hoping that we're taking this model and that we can replicate Indigenous Food Lab and being able to open Indigenous food labs in cities, first off, all over the US. So we can be in Seattle, we can be in Denver, Albuquerque, Boston, Chicago, basically everywhere. And each Indigenous food lab becomes a regional center point for training, for education, for development, and eventually for support. It's going to be one huge step to help us really get to true Indigenous and regional food sovereignty. We need to have healthy food access. We need to have cultural food producers. We need to have regional food systems, and we need to have local control of our food systems, not governmental control. We need to have access to our Indigenous educations, and we need environmental protections. Overall, I think what's really important is first that we have a better understanding of an Indigenous perspective on our own history and the land that we're standing on. I think that we have a better understanding and education of what is Indigenous knowledge base when it comes to living in our environments and how people had survived here for millennia. And I think we just have to understand what we can do to move forward to make our global situation better in general. One easy way to start is just literally going outside your back door and starting to learn the names of the plants right there. Learn the names of the trees around your neighborhood, and then start to branch out from there. There's so many resources to do that right now. And then take it one step further. Start to learn the names of those plants in the language of the land that you happen to be on right now, too. If you can control your food, you can control your destiny, and that's how our Indigenous ancestors lived. They had the blueprint to live sustainably, utilizing plants and animals around us, and we can implement that into today's world. And we're really excited about this because this is both an Indigenous evolution and revolution at the same time. And if we can do this, then we're going to see the benefits and the impact immediately. We know that the future is Indigenous.